This video will be very helpful for you to really understand and clearly see the narcissist in your life and why the relationship was or is such a disaster. You can measure if there really is any chance of happiness once you see them through the lens of emotional maturity. The points I'm going to mention can also help you assess your level of emotional maturity and if there are certain areas that could improve. If you haven't received enough parental support, come from a dysfunctional family, or have a history of childhood trauma, chances are you will be emotionally immature and perhaps not know it. If you were neglected or abused, unless you embark on a healing and learning journey, you will remain emotionally immature. Emotionally immature people really struggle with communication. They're unable to connect with others on a deeper level. They tend to have superficial conversations and have trouble maintaining relationships. Emotional maturity and immaturity is on a spectrum. Some circumstances we could act really immaturely, and other situations can elicit a more emotionally mature response from us. So, maturity and immaturity isn't a black or white issue. And it's a lifetime project that we ideally would be invested in if we want better relationships, more intimacy, or to just be happier in life. And I need to start this video with making an important distinction. Are all narcissists emotionally immature? Yes. But are all immature people narcissists? No. People who are emotionally immature tend to think of themselves first, assuming everything that happens is about them. They take things very personally. They are dependent on external validation and will rely heavily on getting positive attention. They'll steer away from seeing things from another person's perspective and have difficulty empathizing or extending patience to someone else. All feedback, no matter how gently you try to deliver it, will be automatically seen as criticism, an attack, an insult, and you can observe this tinge of paranoia when there really is nothing to be safeguarding against. So their reality testing is a little bit off. What they interpret is something very different from what's been said. Therefore, they're always on the defense, like the whole world's against them. An emotionally mature person will have self regulation skills. What that means is that they will have the ability to tolerate uncomfortable emotions. And it's really important to have this skill because if you don't, you'll automatically and reactively go into a coping mechanism. The emotion will be so intolerable that in order to cope, you'll engage in some sort of behavior which may be destructive. And this is where addictions stem from. We may medicate with food, alcohol. Another way to cope with intolerable emotions is to project them onto others. This is the unconscious reaction. This is when we respond to the conditioning. We can't deal with the anger, so we act out or accuse others of being angry or somehow instigate a situation where that anger is somewhere over there. If we lack self-regulation skills, the emotions will escalate and intensify. We may cry easily and feel very overwhelmed. With narcissists, this inability to regulate shows up as those rage attacks or temper tantrums because clearly they lack those skills. Whereas someone who is able to contain their emotions will be able to calmly discuss the issue. And emotionally immature people tend to always need to be the center of attention, whether that's by being overly loud, being a little bit extra, or covertly. They're sulking, moaning, complaining. But both styles aren't really expressing honestly how they feel. They're meandering, implying. It's a guessing game about how they feel, what they want, what point they're trying to make. Whereas emotionally mature people don't need to be the center of attention. They're able to validate their own emotions, soothe themselves, and embrace the so called negative emotions and actually gain more insight into their own character's nature instead of projecting, venting, raging, blaming. They've gained the wisdom to see the futility and immaturity of responding like that because it pushes people away and just causes more unnecessary dramas. Emotionally immature people cannot control their impulses and they tend to engage in reckless behavior. They lash out, become irrational, highly reactive, and emotionally volatile. They won't be able to reflect or to take responsibility for their part. Instead, they get aggressive, frustrated, yell, and storm out. You can see with narcissists, they will call you names during conflicts and deviate from the central issue at hand. They're unable to apologize and instead stubbornly refuse, hold on, simmer in hostility, and plan their revenge. They cannot take accountability because they lack self awareness, so will instead blame others and remain convinced of their victimization. There's no flexibility of attitude, but rather there's an observable, rigid stance and a closed mindedness with people who are emotionally immature. Whereas an emotionally mature person seeks to resolve conflicts and they enjoy learning, growing, and understanding themselves and the people they're in close relationships with. There's an active participation. Whereas with an immature person, they're passive in relationships. They're content with stagnation and resistant to any change. Perhaps they're afraid of the complexity of how they actually feel. Often things aren't just as simple as one emotion. There's layers. We could be feeling anger, but underneath that anger, there's sadness. And beneath that sadness, we may discover there's an even deeper sense of grief. So it takes time to peel away and lovingly pay attention so we can come to understand ourselves and others. One of the most important things you can take away to demonstrate emotional maturity and improve relationships is to use the word I versus you. When we say, I feel angry when you, it shows emotional maturity because we are owning our emotion instead of accusing the other person of making us angry. If you start conversations with you made me angry, you can see how that will start a battle of you versus me. And this is setting a hostile climate. An emotionally mature person will have the goal in mind of it being a win-win for both parties. Another thing that sets emotionally mature people apart from emotionally immature is their ability to listen deeply and sincerely, trying to understand the other person's inner world, what's in their heart, what's on their mind. It's an active listening where you really pay attention with your body language, open and fully present, asking questions, being patient, not offering instant, unsolicited advice or just listening so you can give advice or your opinion, but listening in order to understand who they are and what they need. Listening is such a loving skill because people trust you when you're able to be present for them and really listen. With narcissists, we're never listened to, but instead we spend 99% of the relationship listening to them and their endless narratives, which are mostly just gibberish about how superior and important they are. They cannot reciprocate and hear you express what's important to you. It can be extremely painful not to be heard or seen, but feel like you're invisible in the relationship. That's what it's like with emotionally immature people. It's like talking to a child about childish things and you endlessly stepping down to their level and them being unable to step up to meet you. Another important aspect that you can look out for is self awareness. How self aware is this person? Are they aware of their emotions? Or there's a pattern where they're endlessly projecting all their emotions onto others and the world. Are they aware of their own thoughts, their own triggers, their traumas, their motives for why they do what they do? This is activating a depth capacity, which unfortunately most people nowadays really lack. This lack of depth in relationships can make us feel very lonely and disconnected. We can be disconnected from ourselves if we don't know our own inner landscape. Or if we do, But another person prefers to be more superficial and is just content discussing the weather, their favorite color, what they had for lunch. This will drive a wedge of an uncomfortable silence between you. Because to be able to communicate what's in your heart and share from the depths of your soul and to feel safe enough to be transparent and vulnerable, that's what makes relationships valuable. They nourish us, support us, and we feel safe because of this deep connection to another person who's willingly meeting us halfway. And the last thing I want to mention, which is extremely important in the context of healing from narcissistic and emotionally immature relationship, is discernment. This is a very valuable skill because it can protect you from getting into relationships that could potentially be hurtful or harmful. This takes time and experience to sharpen your skill of discernment. But you need to discern when to stay, when to walk away, when to say something, when not to say something. It's learning about what's appropriate and with whom, and also observing when you're oversharing and when you're conditioned to withhold emotionally. Discernment goes hand in hand with being able to recognize the emotions of others, being able to observe and make decisions based on your observations, and also being flexible to being completely wrong about your assessment and asking questions to clarify. And always remember that just because someone is intellectually mature or uses fancy words that sound impressive, that doesn't necessarily mean they automatically will have emotional maturity. Intellect and emotions are two different areas that you need to use your observation and discernment with. Narcissists can be very intellectually smart. Psychopaths can be very clever. But talking about emotions elaborately is not the same as feeling emotions or being able to empathize with others. So be really mindful of this and use your listening skills to really hear what's missing in that regard. Because relationships with people who are emotionally immature become very draining, exhausting, because issues don't ever get resolved. Emotionally immature people tend to be irresponsible and prefer to stagnate in chronic denial. It ends up being a miserable, lonely, and very destabilizing experience. So I encourage you to use your discernment, your self awareness by listening to your own heart.